in the chat in the meeting, then we'll send it to them by email if they let us know. So I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me then, and that if anything's going wrong, it'll be dealt with by the other facilitators. So hello and welcome to everybody. Can everyone see me properly? My name's Ellen, and I'm introducing the webinar on alternative ways to decarbonise our heating system. Just to remind people, this is the first of a series planned by Leeds TUC's Environment Group, exploring how trade unions can help create a low-carbon Yorkshire and Humberside. The regional focus is convenient for organising, of course, and for giving some examples, but obviously the discussion's relevant to everyone around the country. I'm going to just briefly set the scene, introduce our four main speakers and explain how we're planning to conduct the rest of the meeting. Okay, so by introduction, we all know that we've got a really brief window of time in which to make the transition to a low carbon economy. It's almost 2 years now since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced projections suggesting that the UK needed to reduce greenhouse gases by 70 to 80% by 2030 if we have a fighting chance of limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. At the same time, we've got the COVID pandemic, which is expected to result in a national and global crisis of unemployment and deep austerity, which will once again impact worst on the poorest and most vulnerable communities. Economic stimulus plans are starting to arrive on the table, and it's really vital that these should be used not to rescue an already failing system and revive the fortunes of those who profit obscenely from our labours, but to support a transition which enables communities to work and live decently on a planet that can support a better and safer life for ourselves and future generations. Trade unions need to be, of course, to be central in this, and that means that as well as understanding the different technological pathways on the table and acquiring the tools to evaluate them, we do need to ask the wider questions. How can we win the democratic participatory public ownership of our energy systems, transport, heavy industry and the rest, which can deliver genuine solutions rather than the risk of a profit-driven greenwash locking in future problems? So we plan to talk about the range of potential space heating systems today, but inevitably a lot of the discussion will relate specifically to the future uses and limitations of hydrogen. This is the big issue that's on the table. Leeds and our wider region is a testbed for the H21 project, which is a proposal to convert the domestic gas supply from natural gas to hydrogen, initially using the technique of steam methane reforming, which requires very large scale carbon capture and storage capacity to deal with the CO2 that's produced as a byproduct. In addition to that, we've just heard this week that 4 of our major unions have written to the Chancellor backing industry calls for a UK-wide hydrogen strategy. They're saying that this will enable energy, transport and heavy industry to decarbonise, protecting and creating jobs. We hope our discussion will help us to critically evaluate this development. So I'm just going to briefly introduce all of our speakers, and then we'll let them speak directly one after another. So first up, I think we're going to have Mike Childs, who as Head of Science, Policy and Research at Friends of the Earth is very well placed to talk about the pros and cons of the different approaches to space heating. Then we will have Dr. Les Levidow, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Open University, and he has, for the past 3 decades, been doing research on various controversies over technological innovations, such as nuclear power, GM crops, biofuels, waste thermal treatments, and now currently hydrogen technologies. He wears many political hats, but most relevant here, he's part of the Green Left within the Green Party. Our third speaker is Tom Knowland, who's Head of Sustainable Energy and Climate Change at Leeds City Council. In this role, he's charged with achieving the Council's corporate priorities for economic, social and environmental improvement, and all at the same time rather than one of these at the expense of another. And then finally, we'll have Sam Mason, who's policy officer at the PCS union. The PCS union has been one of the driving forces in the climate movement within the trade union movement. She's the lead, Sam is the lead author of the PCS publication, Just Transition and Energy Democracy, a Civil Service Approach. Hopefully Sam will be able to elaborate on this theme and help us to think about how we work for this just transition within our unions. So just quickly how we hope to run the remainder of the meeting. So in the next section, we'll ask the speakers to just go one after another for around 10 minutes each. And then following this, we're going to have a section where questions and comments can be taken from other attendees. And if people can just think about, just attend to how we want to run this bit. So to make this easier for our facilitators, can I ask that attendees place their comments or questions for the panel only in the chat box, because that's going to be monitored by our facilitators, and they'll use these selectively to avoid duplication of questions. If you wish to actually come on and speak your comment, you'll have to wait to be invited to speak, and you'll need to be brought in by a facilitator and then unmute yourself. To get our attention, make sure that you've selected the all attendees option. There's a drop down within the chat that allows you to select who you're speaking to. So select all attendees as the option for the display on the chat. If you want to speak your comment, please indicate this within the chat, including your name and, if appropriate, the preferred panelist that you want to respond to your question or comment. And all comments should be limited to 2 minutes, and please, because we don't have very much time to get through this very busy topic, and you will be timed on that. And then finally, we'll allow, when it gets to about 25 to 1, I'd say we will we'll stop the questions and comments and move to a final period of roundup by our invited panelists. So they'll have about 5 minutes each to just maybe to refocus on what they think are the main themes, or to respond to specific things that have come up. So I think without any further ado, I think if we can just move directly on to our panellists. I hope everything's working properly. Is it okay then if we begin with you, Mike?
It is, grand. I'm sat in York, so I'm in the right part of the world as well for this conversation. That's where I live. So firstly, if I can just, I'll try and be brief so we can keep as long for questions as possible. So I'll skip over some areas quickly. And focused, predominantly around the hydrogen issue, but that's a context around it we need to understand as well, and I'm sure we do. Ellen mentioned that we need very deep carbon reductions by 2030, and whatever pathway we look for decarbonising heat, we need to, what can we do quickly to get those deep reductions by 2030. Energy efficiency has to be at the front of that pack for what we need to do. Clearly, there are lots of reasons for taking action on energy efficiency. Fuel poverty is foremost amongst them, and that will require action to improve regulations in the private renter sector, more money going into refurbishment of social sector, and regulatory measures to incentivise, and financial support to incentivise owner-occupiers to install energy efficiency measures as well. Within the COVID-19 context, of course, we know that can bring lots of jobs pretty quickly. Energy efficiencies, industrial group, infrastructure group, I should say, just this week or late last week, produced a report saying, we could get 200,000 new jobs in this area. And this is potentially a route for thinking about the TUC promoted Green Jobs Guarantee scheme, which we are supporting and encouraging as well. So energy efficiency ought to be the bedrock of any pathway we take, regardless of what we use to actually provide heat into our homes. We need to do the energy efficiency, and we've done virtually nothing on energy efficiency across the UK in the last 10 years, shockingly. So the second thing I'd say is we see a big role for heat pumps in our homes. We and others are pushing for us to try and install 10 million heat pumps by 2030. It's a proven technology. It's the most fitted technology in Sweden now. It works. I've got one in my house here. There is a challenge in terms of the cost. At the moment, you have to buy it yourself, and you'll get some of the money back over 7 years by government. That's clearly constrains who that's open to people who have got some money in the bank. The government are talking about moving to a capital grant scheme, not large enough to cover the whole cost. So again, that would exclude poorer households. And they're also talking about a cap on that, which would mean it would take 1,500 years to fit the number of pumps we need to fit as well. So the current proposals from government fall well short of what's needed. The reason for a strong focus on heat pumps is we can roll them out now and quickly. So that's kind of I think the backbone of any heating strategy, energy efficiency and heat pumps. So what about the role of hydrogen? Well, firstly, we do need hydrogen in our economy as we move forward, but we need to prioritise where it's most needed. And those should be in uses where there are no other obvious replacements. So for example, in decarbonising our industry, whether that's primary steel, potentially cement, and there's some experimental work going there, chemicals industry, glass and ceramics, that's where we ought to be seeing where we produce hydrogen. That's where we should go first for that. There is some argument for some trains and some HGVs, but again, electrics can be much more efficient in those. So there will be some niche applications there, but predominantly electricity. We do need, as we move towards a more renewable, low carbon systems and backup for electricity production. And again, that's where we can use hydrogen production, use excess electricity production in the summer to generate methane and hydrogen, and use that in the winter to back up electricity production, much in the same way that we store rain in the winter and use it in the summer. We should store that energy in the summer and use it in the winter. But there will be a role, some role, for using hydrogen as a backup for heat pumps when peak demand is most strong in hybrid heat pumps systems. So heat pumps that use electricity 90–95% of the time, but very occasionally will switch through to hydrogen as a backup. And that's a technology the Committee on Climate Change are promoting. In terms of production of hydrogen, then Ellen mentioned steam methane reformation using CCS. Well, firstly, that's not zero carbon. I mean, you have the fugitive emissions that comes from the natural gas extraction itself that are significant. And CCS itself is only 88–85% efficient. Apart from those things, which are big barriers, we think anyway, it is also going to take too long. It's going to be the 2030s before we're going to have any, could have any amount of hydrogen produced by that route, by which time we should have decarbonised most of our home heating sector anyway. So electrolysis is the route making hydrogen from renewable power. It's more expensive now, but the costs are falling. 10 years time, they'll probably be comparable with steam methane reformation. Electrolysis obviously requires more renewable energy generation. Last year, the UK only built 3 gigawatts of renewable energy generation, the lowest for a decade. We ought to be building something like 14 gigawatts per year. And again, that's a very big jobs creation opportunity for the UK as well. So to conclude, basically we think energy efficiency and heat pumps are the way forward in terms of dealing with heating. There will be a role for hydrogen, particularly in industry, and for some backup for electricity and hybrid heat pumps, but that should be made from renewable power.
Thank you very much. That was very succinct and good, comprehensive discussion. Yep. Can I bring in Les then, please?
I'm trying to share screen.
Do I need to enable that now?
Yeah, I have the PowerPoint file on my screen. But
have you not got a menu across the bottom with a share screen button?
Oh, share. Okay, here we go.
Right.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So here's the title, which has the argument I'll be making: decarbonizing natural gas, locking in a capitalist energy-intensive system, which preempts alternatives. Now it's not moving on to the next page. Oh, here we are. Press harder. Okay. So in general, I have done academic research along with my many colleagues in my area, science and technology studies. We analyze how any techno-scientific innovation combines all these elements: a narrative of societal progress, a technological design invested with expectations about benefits, infrastructural continuity or change with a potential lock-in, social order and organization, nature, its definition, exploitation, conservation, and political economic power. So here I pose the question: how are all these forms combined in the agenda for decarbonizing natural gas? Well, Ellen referred to the announcement last week from the Hydrogen Strategy Now, a coalition of many companies supported by leaderships of the energy unions, as they call themselves. And on that webpage, there was prominently displayed the Union Jack, and we should remember that for its colonial victims, it meant that the sun never set and the blood of innocents never dried. Here it symbolizes a cross-class alliance, subordinating the working class to its exploiters. That's a form of social order. Now, trade unions have a global divergence in responding to capitalist agendas. On the one side, mainly trade unions in the carbon-intensive sectors, as exemplified by this speech from Tim Roach last year. He said, "Today, school children all around the world are striking to demand climate action and fair play to them. Outside the classroom, workers occupy their failing yards and whole communities take to the streets. The elite's willful neglect of the communities that once drove the UK economy is there for all to see. It's a story of our leaders' failure to put people or planet before the interests of a broken economic system. For working class communities, the much touted green jobs revolution is in danger of passing us by." Great, but then he makes an enormous leap. Somehow, therefore, we need investment in green gases like hydrogen to help decarbonize the gas system while providing infrastructure and securing gas jobs for the next generation. Actually, I think he means blue gases, but we'll come back to that. And then on the other side, trade unions that tend to be in the public sector, as expressed by TUED, which promotes an agenda to reclaim, resist, and restructure our energy system, especially by ending corporate ownership and control. We need to create new forms of public community ownership rather than trust the capitalist system to ensure a better future. Now, the UK energy unions promote a nationalistic global race to beat the competition. As in the letter they sent last week, the Chancellor, we can look across the world and see other nations bringing forward a billion-pound job-creating hydrogen strategies. The UK cannot afford to being left behind. Failure would result in the UK not meeting its net zero obligation and the loss of highly skilled quality jobs. And this relates to the promises from Hydrogen Strategy Now to unlock export opportunities and making for the use of the UK's natural resources, which seems to be its natural gas deposits. And this alliance, let's say subordination of the energy unions to a natural gas agenda, goes back at least 3 years to the H21, meaning Hydrogen 21st Century North of England project, launched in 2018, linking Northern Gas Networks, Cadent, and Equinor. They promised a hydrogen blueprint unveiled to make over 3.7 million homes near emission-free by 2034. Near, what does that mean? We'll return to that as well. Now, the dominant agenda perpetuates fossil fuels. Now, as Mike explained, hydrogen is simply a medium for storage and transmission of energy with diverse sources. But the sources are the crucial factor. Green hydrogen comes from electrolyzing water, very expensive, but perhaps sensible if low carbon electricity is in surplus at a particular time. By contrast, blue hydrogen comes from decarbonizing natural gas. The latter would use carbon capture, use and storage technology from Equinor, Norway's national oil company, by storing the carbon in disused oil installations in the North Sea. CCUS is also imagined to use waste CO2 as a chemical feedstock for synthetic high-value chemicals, as a promise of valuable export. The new system has been promoted for several wishful benefits, and thus as a national imperative for state investment. The Hydrogen Strategy Now coalition deepens a long-standing capitalist agenda, indefinitely extending fossil fuels by raising expectations for CCS while downplaying its technical difficulties and enormous energy demand. And here's one of many reports published in recent years, promoting what they call the cost challenge, meaning to bring down the costs of CCUS. Now, CCS and likewise CCUS should be seen as a false promise, which provides a convenient alibi. It has many difficulties. As Mike said, it needs a great energy input, which potentially undermine greenhouse gas savings, captures only some of the CO2 emissions, has been financially viable at large scale only through enhanced oil recovery. It is pumping the carbon into an oil reservoir to increase the pressure and so facilitate extraction. Hence, futile from a climate perspective. And it remains implausible as significant means to decarbonize fossil fuels in the foreseeable future. The fundamental problem here is capitalist economic structures driving rises in resource usage, including fossil fuels. CCS has minimal prospects to remove the greenhouse gas emissions from them, as argued in a TUED report a few years ago. But regardless of its eventual failure, CCS provides a convenient alibi for carbon-intensive industry with its allies in the state and trade unions. Now, I argue here that this agenda locks in an energy-intensive centralized system. Natural gas is promoted as a UK natural resource. Its extraction and even greater import would be continued. It requires an enormous energy demand. Now, so far, Norway's industrial uses of CCS have been powered by renewable electricity. By contrast, the UK's space heating would require many times greater energy input, especially for the carbon extraction, transport, and storage. What would be the energy sources to ensure a truly low carbon blue hydrogen? And how to avoid rivalry with the many other demands on this low carbon energy? This leads to a lock-in. A centralized infrastructural investment would reinforce path dependency. It would be locked in for decades and thus delay or marginalize longer-term, lower carbon solutions. That was a concern expressed by the Committee on Climate Change. Green jobs? Well, there have been grand claims for thousands of secure, skilled jobs far into the future, but these claims warrant careful scrutiny, just as one of many possible limitations mentioned in a consultancy report. Now, across the many houses whose systems and boilers would need conversion, the task would need to be paced with the expansion of hydrogen supplies, and workers would need considerable geographical mobility around the conversion region. As a more fundamental issue here, in this agenda, the UK's net zero obligation is evaded. Hydrogen Strategy Now defers its dubious solution for many years, blurs the criteria for success versus failure, likewise blurs responsibility, and, if necessary, can retrospectively shift the blame to deficient technology, which turned out to be deficient. Market control by the natural gas industry, along with the centralized system, would be reinforced. This agenda relegates working class communities to the passive role of energy consumers, along with some wage laborers, and subordinates them to a cross-class alliance with for a global race. We could say sarcastically, workers of the world, unite with your national capitalists. This agenda plays a preemptive role. It ensures system continuity while preempting alternative forms of energy enterprise, such as worker community cooperatives, along with other lower carbon technologies beyond fossil fuels. So final slide here. As TBD has said, we must develop transformational strategies that are anchored in a paradigm of sharing, solidarity, and sufficiency. How? Well, after the decades-long neoliberal assault, hollowing out and financializing the local state for profit-driven ventures, we need a public interest state to facilitate the collective capacities necessary for alternatives. Here are some big questions. How to break the nationalistic cross-class alliance? How to build non-capitalist alternatives with potential allies here and abroad as people who cooperate rather than be seen as competing with us in a global race. How to gain both national and local state support for such alternatives. How to rebuild the local state around public community ownership of energy systems, perhaps other systems. And finally, what can we learn about successful strategies? Hopefully the next speakers will have some answers to these questions. Thank you. And for the rest of this weekend, you might like to follow the online Eco-Socialist Conference for Climate Justice. There's the website.
Thank you very much for that, Les. That was brilliant. Can you remove your screen sharing?
Unshare. Oh, here we are. Stop share. Here we go.
Again.
Right.
Brilliant. That was fantastic, and amazingly it fitted exactly into 10 minutes as well. The list of questions that you've left us with there at the end, I think we could all do with a lot more reflection and pondering and discussion of those. And it's probably worth at this point mentioning that we've planned a follow-up meeting to this webinar on the evening of the 7th of July, which is a Tuesday. And I think that would be a really good opportunity to discuss and debate those kinds of, to think more deeply about this wider political context that you've sketched out for us, and what that implies for the way that we need to organise as workers. And and hopefully we'll be able to people will be able to take away a copy of those slides as well that they can think about in between. Guess our other facilitators can check up on that. Let's move now to Tom Knowland, who's going to bring the discussion, I guess, inwards again towards our local scene in Leeds and the region. Tom.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. So Tom Knowland, I work for Leeds City Council in the Council's Sustainable Energy and Air Quality team. The team there is working on large energy and air quality projects, mainly the kind of projects that really no other part of the city can take forward. So our biggest one, which is relevant to what we're talking about today, and those of you who know the centre of Leeds will know that the hedgerow has been dug up just recently, and that's because we've been putting in a large district heating scheme that takes the waste heat from the energy from waste plant and pumps it up firstly to some council flats up near St James's Hospital, and now it's into the city centre, and it'll soon be dropping down to the South Bank area, and that'll be providing low carbon heat to homes and businesses across Leeds. So I think I raised that because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about today. I'll just give a little bit more detail about what's going on in Leeds. So Leeds, as many of you will know, declared a climate emergency last year and has set ambitious targets. Firstly, to decarbonise the council's own estate and operations by 2030, and has set the ambition for the city to do the same. Now, obviously, heating is a crucial element of that, and I think Mike raised some, absolutely, totally spot-on points when he raised some of the challenges around that. The first priority of any approach to heat decarbonisation is to use less of the damn stuff in the first place. Insulate homes, insulate buildings, and Leeds has more than its fair share of Victorian back-to-back terraces, which are very difficult to retrofit, very expensive to retrofit. But one of the first things that the council set out when it declared the climate emergency was for the government to treat domestic energy efficiency programs as a national infrastructure priority. It really needs to be taken forward at a large scale, and particularly as we come out of COVID, many of the jobs that would create would be for firms, SMEs, who've been unable to work during the pandemic, unable to get on site. So there'll be huge opportunities there. But I guess it's important that we talk about hydrogen. Leeds kind of got thrown into the hydrogen debate, really whether we liked it or not, when NGN announced their H21 project a few years ago, and in which they set out or proposed that Leeds would be one of the first cities in the UK to convert to 100% hydrogen. So we decided, right, we better get involved in this then, if this is an important conversation that's going on, not just locally but nationally. So we've engaged with NGN. We have regular meetings with NGN, and we have a liaison group that actually involves not just NGN but also the two universities in Leeds, and also colleagues from across West Yorkshire, the Humber and Teesside, because hydrogen cannot be seen as just a Leeds only option. It only makes sense whether that's for heating or transport if you start to look at it regionally, something potentially across the north of England. So those of you who know about the H21 project will know that it proposes continuing to make hydrogen from natural gas with the necessary carbon capture and storage, which would be vital for that. I think Mike made some important points about actually, well, would it make more sense to look at hydrogen in the first instance from an industry perspective and looking at decarbonising some of the high carbon hubs, particularly local to here, say at Humberside. Or industries like glass, of which we have some representation in Leeds. And I think, yeah, that may be the way that hydrogen starts to come in. But I think what the most likely outcome, I suspect, is going to be a hybrid of different solutions for different places. In Leeds, I could well imagine, if hydrogen were a viable technology, that it would have to sit alongside our district heating scheme, and indeed alongside electrification. The main challenge with electrification, which at the moment I have the nervousness that is the kind of the policy drift of the country, and the opportunity to evaluate that correctly against other options is not really being pursued. The main challenge with electrification is just the sheer amount of reinforcement of the grid that would be required, so that the grid could cope with that coldest day in February that the gas grid can accommodate relatively easily. So I think that's the huge challenge, and all the carbon issues that come with that, sourcing the cabling, sourcing the insulating materials, which are themselves greenhouse gas and so on. So I think neither hydrogen nor electrification should be viewed as easy options. They're both extremely difficult and both expensive, which I think comes to the main point that I'd like to get across, which is I think where local authorities can start to play a really important role. And I think it's being underplayed at the moment in this debate. Any conversion of infrastructure, be that from natural gas to hydrogen, or away from natural gas towards increased electrification. Whenever we've been through these big infrastructure conversions before as a country, so some of you will remember the conversion from Towns gas to natural gas in the late 60s and 70s. We can all remember the switch from analog to digital TV, and more of us now are abandoning our landlines as there's a switch over to mobile phones. All of those conversions have basically, although they've been, there's been increased costs for the consumer's actually had a better product as a result of it. So it's been easier to sell. At the moment, I think one of the things that's been really underplayed, particularly with hydrogen, kind of engaging with members of the public, is to say to them, right, we're going to switch your gas, and a lot of people don't really know what the gas is, nor care, nor why should they, from one gas to another gas, and you don't really know what that is either, except you've heard it's hydrogen, so that's possibly a bit dangerous, and it's going to cost you more, which I don't think is a great message to sell. So I think the opportunity for conversion, whether that is to hydrogen or to electrification, should be, that opportunity must be taken to accompany that with massive large-scale retrofit of homes and buildings. If it were hydrogen, then as we know, that would require the replacement of household appliances. So the likelihood is that you'd have gas engineers going into people's homes maybe once, possibly twice, even possibly 3 times to switch those appliances over. To my way of thinking, it is vital that opportunity, that point of conversion, is taken to maximise the other co-benefits that you can get from increased energy efficiency. So for unable to pay households, it should be free retrofit at scale, including all the difficult stuff, external wall insulation, to get that done. For those who are able to pay, it should include a rapid energy assessment so that you know what needs to be done, and then the introduction of attractive financial incentives to have your home massively improved, so that whatever the conversion is, be that is to hydrogen or electrification, the consumer is getting a better outcome, i.e. they are needing less heat. And then you get all the added co-benefits of reduced fuel poverty, improved health, improved educational performance, reduced crime, and so on and so forth, that would come from such a large-scale conversion. It's my concern at the moment, and this is one that is shared across the council, that element of the discussion around hydrogen is really not being addressed, possibly because the debate is being led by the gas network operators, whose job is to transport gas and not to reduce its use, which is where I think the authorities can play a key role. So Leeds has set out some principles of hydrogen conversion, which I'll just find now, but my computer's just decided to freeze up, so bear with me. So our principles for hydrogen conversion, and like I say, this really does apply to a great extent to electrical conversion as well, is to recognise the role that local authorities can play in conversion, and the considerable influence and ability we have to convene local partners, to develop some sort of national centre for hydrogen conversion with local government representation, making sure that all the various different conversion initiatives that are going on around the country at the moment have some degree of coordination. If it is going to be hydrogen, and it requires a clear national policy, and if it's not going to be hydrogen, then it needs a clear national policy around something else. Whatever it is, it should be a clear policy framework, and that should include getting clarity on all the other things that need to be taken into account, such as CCS, transport, and the possibilities that hydrogen or electrification offers around that. Involve local authorities, if it's a hydrogen route, in hydrogen trials, and making the safety case for hydrogen and ensuring you get public buy-in. And I'll emphasize it again, ensure that the opportunity is taken during conversion to make sure that the visits to properties maximize the co-benefits of energy savings at the same time. insist that any new appliances required, whether that would appliances that would be hydrogen enabled or ones that would be electrical, are the very best in terms of energy efficiency, though, so that people enjoy the benefits of reducing their energy consumption. Support future research. I haven't really mentioned much about the economic advantages of hydrogen conversion, but I think it is worth I'm sure that will come up in discussion, that in Yorkshire we have quite a heavy reliance on fossil fuel industries across the whole of Yorkshire and indeed the north of England. And things like whether we go to a hydrogen future or an electrical future or a hybrid between the two, and in greater use of district heating and so on, there are new jobs and skills there that need to be required so that we have some sort of just transition for those people who are currently employed in fossil fuel dependent industries in their switch over to a new low carbon economy. And also, I think Mike raised it as well, that if we're going to do the hydrogen conversion, then you've got to accompany that with increased production of renewable electricity so that hydrogen from electrolysis becomes competitive and available at scale, whether that's for heating or for transport. We also pursue renewable gas, such as biogas, and avoiding the use of shale gas and other fossil fuels. So I've said quite a lot there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and I look forward to the discussion later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. You've given us loads of food for thought there. I'm just going to pick out just a couple of things that stood out to me about what you were saying, which is one of the things being the conflict between the kind of holistic view of things that's needed, with all the different components of a low carbon economy, and including impacts on jobs, workers, residents, but also the way that the different technologies fit together in the sectors. That is stands in conflict with the kind of focus on selling a product, which comes to the fore when you've got the agenda set by the industry. It's interesting. You said a lot about the need for retrofitting and energy efficiency in domestic buildings, and also. You talked about the connection between when it comes to talking about hydrogen, that placing it in the context also of the technologies that are needed to decarbonise the heavy industries that we've got in the region, especially around the Humber. These production of chemicals and metals and all these primary products, and it's just worth mentioning at this point that I think these are the two things that are going to be the subject of our next couple of webinars, something about buildings and homes, which will be a lot of focus on things like insulation and the jobs transition and the training that's needed for that. And also very much, again, something about how we can move towards decarbonising the heavy industries. Those are absolute musts for our webinar series. So keep an eye out for that. I'm just going to finally move on to Sam, please, and hope the other facilitators are managing to keep up. And as I say, keep putting your questions and comments in the chat, and indicate who you would like to respond to them. Is Sam there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Brilliant. Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Off you go.
Okay, I have got a presentation which I can share afterwards, but I'm just going to read through it for now because Les's didn't come up on my screen, so I don't know if I've got a problem. I don't want to waste time on that. So anyway, thanks very much, Ellen, for this invitation to participate in this event. And it's been absolutely fascinating hearing the other three speakers. So inevitably, I'm going to sort of cross over on some similar issues. But my approach to what I'm going to say today around alternative ways decarbonising the heat system is to look at this in terms of a climate justice pathway. And the reason why I say that is because for PCS Trade Union, and for those who may not be familiar with us as a trade union, we're the biggest civil service trade union. So we have members across civil service, central government departments, also in public sector bodies and privatised sectors, including aviation. So climate justice is actually very important to how we talk about climate change and green transition issues. As a trade union, we have also declared a climate emergency in June last year. And for us, that's not a symbolic action. That's about how we actually use that around building demands in what we do with the employer to actually respond to the climate crisis. The one first thing I just wanted to make reference to, because I think in these past weeks, probably like everybody else in any presentation I'm making, it's impossible to do that without reference to COVID and the situation we're in and the global pandemic. And I've read a lot of green recovery plans and proposals, probably like many of you. And one thing I think that does stand out, which isn't often said, and this actually came from quite an unlikely source, but I just wanted to quote that we have to recognise that obviously COVID and this pandemic is a physical shock, and recognise that in relation to financial shocks and obviously how we dealt with the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 and the reasons for that. And as they say in their quote, that the current pandemic is a foretaste of what a full-fledged climate crisis could entail in terms of simultaneous exogenous shocks to supply and demand, disruption of supply chains and global transmission and amplification mechanisms. And I think this is exactly what we've seen if we look across the renewables sector. There's even developing that at the moment. There are all kinds of supply chain issues. So this whole idea around developing our own indigenous supply chains is really important, and that's not from a nationalist perspective. And the kind of competition that Les was touching on, I think we shouldn't be exploiting other countries' resources, which certainly they need for their own decarbonisations and transition pathways. So I want to kind of talk about heat decarbonisation in a climate justice framing, because we think decarbonisation isn't just about meeting those targets, although it's very important, but it's also about economic, social, environmental and political justice in doing that. So what do we mean for that? I think from the start point, privatisation and profit do not go hand in hand with climate adaptation and market-based solutions. As soon as we've got the profit motive there, and I think this is what we're seeing from the gas sector and how to maintain their role and profit motive within the transition process, particularly from the network companies who get vast profits out of that and through our energy bills. That becomes immediately incompatible with our wider aims, and particularly if we're looking at wider climate justice aims. So in a way as well, so around the economic case, we can have energy affordability, the distributions of gains across society, and obviously workers on a non-profit basis, and obviously develop the decent work, as it's called, and wages, etc. On a social side, obviously that includes the just transition principles for workers and communities, but again, socialising our cost of transition so that everybody benefits and it's done on an equitable basis. On the environmental side, it's important to recognise health benefits along with decarbonisation, that there's non-discrimination in terms of the projects which are pursued. So where projects are cited against particular types of communities, that could be racialised discrimination, low-income communities, which often, as we see, bear the brunt of the effects of air pollution, etc. And also in terms of carbon budgets, which comes into some of this question, if we look at our overall global and national level carbon budgets, where do we put what's left and into what resources? And on the political side is really important, because this is about participative democracy and control. And it's about who gets to take the decisions about what pathways we follow. So for PCS, it's always been very clear that transformation is very key in the just transition process. And we're not just arguing for, whilst obviously people need to have jobs and we have to protect livelihoods, etc. But it's not just a sort of capitalist green job swap, because you have one job here, you'll get one in the new sort of sector or industry as well. So we have to actually change things and also talk about and think about unorganised workers. So scaling up justice through heating decarbonisation. So again, I've touched on some of these, but can address issues of fuel poverty and rising energy bills. From a health aspect, obviously warm homes are healthy homes and they avoid other external costs such as to the health service and excess in winter deaths, which estimated 1.4 billion cost to the NHS at the moment, arising from bad housing, which isn't just efficiency issues, obviously reducing carbon and other environmental impacts. Public service and restoring our public services. We need a public service approach to decarbonisation, and I think this probably chimes in a bit of what Tom was just saying. One, we need a national programme, we need clear policy, but we need local delivery through local area planning and control, which engages with communities and workers and through a more worker-public partnership about what that transition starts to look like at a local level. And that brings in some participative democracy, so systems are not imposed on people, one, without understanding what they are or why they might be the best options, but people actually start to understand the systems in which they live. And I think, you know, around heat networks, there's some really disturbing examples, there's some good examples, but I know, for example, one particular site in London, in South London, where they've had a heat network imposed on them. It's tied into E.ON with extortionate fuel costs that they're tied into for 60 years, which the residents in a social housing development can't get out of. So again, that's not particularly just. And of course, we want to create climate jobs, and we typically talk about climate jobs, not green jobs, jobs that are lowering greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just, as I say, this kind of green job swap, and this is regionally and locally. And also, again, coming back to equities. So this is equal for everybody. There's no winners or losers, as much as possible. So we address the inherent inequality of the capitalist system and the market-based system that we have. And I think what's really important as well, particularly in light of the student strikes, is that we don't leave legacy costs. And carbon capture and storage for us leaves a legacy cost of CO2 trapped in the ground that is still there, and will still have to be dealt with at some point. So whilst in the final, it needs unlimited CCS, that has to be made on a really clear judgment about where that goes in line with the carbon budgets. And obviously, as it's been talked about in a region like Yorkshire and Humberside, we have a lot of heavy industry reliant on fossil fuels, then it may have to be prioritised into those areas, but it's done with that understanding, but still investing in alternatives to come out of CCS in the long term. And I've got to be honest, when I hear talk of creating markets for captured carbon in the North Sea beds, I find that absolutely horrendous. But anyway, but I think the other things, we need a systemic approach to energy transition, and we need to understand what energy is for. So we have to change that question. We often go straight to the technology, and okay, we've had fossil fuels, we look at renewables, but let's look at it in a different way and assess how we understand energy, whether that's in the power sector, heating, cooling, transport, construction and agriculture and other sectors. And for us, it's part of a whole economy approach. It's not just about the supply side, it's about the need to assess demands, and again, coming back to that, who energy is for, and getting away from what we're doing at the moment, as it appears, is trying to bolt decarbonisation onto the current system rather than rethinking that. And of course, that's because it's based on profit and market-based motives, the industry fossil fuel incumbents who are driving us to this end, and that likewise links us to the need to look at social and economic factors of energy transformation, not just the technological factors. So that's why Les had referred to Trade Unions for Energy Democracy and the work that they do, which we're very much part of, and coming out of their Resist, Reclaim, Restructure agenda, mainly around the power sector. So what we think, and I don't think it's divergent from any other speakers, is that the first thing we need to do is scale up retrofit. As the Institution of Engineering Technology report in partnership with Nottingham University said, we need a nationwide programme to upgrade the existing housing stock, and it's the only way for the UK to achieve its carbon saving goals. Similarly, the International Energy Agency They said energy efficiency should be recognised as the first fuel, offering a win-win in terms of lower emissions and the need to retrofit homes. So I think we have to not just look at the energy source. We all know that if we just electrify everything, we're never going to have the capacity in the system to have all the individual privatised electric cars, the electrolysis for green hydrogen. Some of it probably will be needed, obviously, in sectors like transport and for storage reasons. So we need a proper assessment of that as well. And where's my next one? So this does pose a lot of challenges and opportunities. I think we have to be clear about the scale of the challenge, and this is certainly something which trade unions and the ones which Ellen had referred to, the 4 trade unions that are calling for this sector deal around hydrogen. To retrofit homes, we need to be retrofitting 1.5 homes every minute from now until 2050. We need to convert 20,000 homes a week in terms of other low carbon energy sources. So the task is enormous. That will require lots and lots of workers. We need to do whole house renovations. One of the arguments against this is that we don't want major disruption into homes in terms of retrofit and energy needs, but I think, and again, Tom was alluding to it, that if we take it in as a whole package and can understand that this is what's going to happen over this period of time and why it's happening, I think that's the only way to engage. And I think, you know, we can all sort of appreciate that the example I like to give, that under the privatised system that we have at the moment, when you have your street dug up because the electricity providers are coming, the gas networks and then the water endlessly, it makes absolutely no sense and infuriates us all. But that is the only way we're going to do it. We have to look at organisational means as well, which are challenging. Obviously, the consumer demand and costs, workforce skills and training and financing. But this is a huge opportunity to have clarity on policy, opportunity in terms of equity and low carbon homes for everybody at the same scale and quality, opportunity for creating jobs through the supply chain and through public services, which have been enormously hollowed out and part of this wider just transition process. Opportunity to have integration with other energy resources, so heat networks, district heating, so in terms of the retrofit, so it's not one but understanding everything and linked obviously into transport and how our cities are designed. And obviously it's not just about the city and urban areas, rural areas as well, which need to be understood what best suits their need. And it gives an opportunity for the local engagement and redesigning the energy markets and pricing and challenging the market-based model. So we have it under a public ownership and democratic control model. So the trade unions, this is my final point. We're divided. There are 4 trade unions that have decided to claim themselves as the energy unions, which is Unite, GMB, Prospect and Unison. They disagree that other unions who are not in energy or industrial sectors should have a role in the debate, and particularly around broader industrial strategies. We disagree on 2030 versus 2050 climate targets, and obviously that has an impact in terms of pace and scale of doing the transition. We disagree in terms of an economistic approach versus a more political and systemic transition approaches, and rooted with social justice rooted at the heart of it. Sectors versus the whole economy. I said public sector versus industrial unions. We tend to have more alignment around public sector trade unions. And also job for the boys. And for me, this is a really crucial point because I think a lot of our energy transition discussions are really about replicating a culture of male jobs. And it's not just about training more women in STEM, etc., and getting them on boards and this kind of thing. It relates to those discussions which have actually come up in the past few months around the pandemic about what value we have for different jobs in society and who actually carries out those roles and functions in our society, and which underpins how everything happens. So I think we have to be really careful in these discussions to make sure that we're actually valuing everybody's work. And when we're looking at transitions, and we often talk around these high skill jobs that we have to protect, and of course we do, but we have to recognise in the skills in all jobs and around the care and health economy, which, as we've seen, are so vitally important, which are all part of this discussion. I just end on a more positive note. We are united around retrofit and some of the social aims around that, such as fuel poverty. We disagree perhaps on how that should be carried out. But I think, again, what's critical to this, and Les has mentioned some of it, is obviously our solidarity. And our solidarity has to be with our brothers and sisters in the global south particularly, and all our decisions which we take have to be framed within that. So whether it's from the little part of northeast London that I'm sitting in, and obviously the Leeds where you are, to everywhere, this is a global problem as much as it's regional, national, regional, local. I think we have to have those underpinning principles to all of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was really brilliant, and loads and loads to think about there. I think that what has emerged is a huge amount of, given that we've had 4 speakers with very different roles and maybe work priorities, but a lot of commonality has emerged, both in specifics like the way that we need to prioritise things like energy efficiency through retrofitting, but also through the broader theme that we need an integrated, holistic approach, that we as you expressed it well, that we can't bolt a transition onto the existing system, and that in order to do this we need something like a public service approach that enables participatory democratic ownership and involvement at every level, really. And I really want to just really endorse what you said towards the end about the gender bias that can occur in this debate, because it's something that we think about a lot, as you've said, in other contexts, that the undervaluing of the roles that have traditionally been very feminized, as we might put it, that work in care, in education support, in healthcare, or indeed, you know, the unpaid work of parenting and informal caring as well. And if we're taking a holistic approach, we really can't just replicate that kind of it's not, as you say, not just about shifting more women into the high status jobs that are deemed to be highly skilled. It's about acknowledging the skill that's involved in the traditionally feminized sectors, upgrading them and paying a lot more, and that has to be part of our debate. So and I do think that can be, I've certainly found it to be a sticking point when you're discussing this with trade unionists in those major unions. And we have sort of behind the scenes been conscious of the fact that our panel is very male dominated, and that is reflective of, and it probably will continue to be so over the next few sessions. That is reflective of the way that the sectors are structured and the people that are campaigning around these things, but we think that needs to change. And I also just briefly want to endorse what you said about the need for a very internationalist perspective, because, you know, at the end of the day, it is it's the poorest of the working class communities and the indigenous communities around the world that are suffering unimaginably from the extractivist sort of system that it applies both to the materials, to the workers, to the communities, and they're at the forefront of the struggle, and people are dying as a result of defending their lands and their quality of life. So we have to take that wider perspective. Right, I'm going to hand over, if this is going to work, I hope it is, to our other 2 facilitators to present us with some of the questions and comments, and just indicate to me if there's somebody who needs to be enabled to speak.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone, and great speeches indeed. So we have quite a few questions. Some friends ask to speak directly. Some others ask me or Andy if we can read the questions ourselves. So if that's okay, Alan, can you enable John Bassendine to speak? And sorry, anyone, if I get the wrong pronunciation. I'm not mother tongue, so for surnames, sometimes I get them wrong.
Right, so John should be able to speak now if he unmutes.
Yes, I think I have unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Oh, well, I had an email this morning from the group Possible, We Are Possible, about a scheme in East London which is under threat because of the proposed removal of the RHI incentives. I see there's quite a lot on the chat about it, so really Possible are one of the are just one of the organisations like Friends of the Earth who are on the ball with regard to this campaign. But if people want to initiate a letter to their MPs, they can do it through the We Are Possible site. The other point I wanted to ask was about the conversion of the gas distribution system. I have read that the current gas distribution system could be utilised without conversion with up to 40% of hydrogen, either green or blue hydrogen, in the mix. Is that correct? Does any of the speakers know if that is correct?
I can jump in if you want. At the moment, there's surety that 20% of the mix could be hydrogen, but there's piloting going on to see whether it could be up to 40%, if possible. That doesn't deliver 40% of the same amount of energy because hydrogen doesn't have as much energy embedded within it as methane. So it's not as though you're replacing, it's not quite a like for like replacement. So if you replace 40% with hydrogen, you're probably only getting, I don't know what the sums are, 25% of your energy from hydrogen, that route. As part of the transition, then perhaps that's part of the...
So perhaps I could say that one of the consequences from that is that a large-scale conversion to 100% hydrogen system, rather like we had with the conversion from town gas to natural gas, is your preferred way forward. Would that be correct?
I think we've talked about wanting to take an electrification route primarily and only using hydrogen as a backup during the kind of peak winter energy periods that Tom talked about.
But there were also problems with that, weren't there, with regard to the massive upgrading of the power system, the power transmission system that would be needed for that.
I'll just answer once more and then I'll let the chair.
Yeah, I think we need to move
having a chat.
To the next.
Right, can I just answer that quickly and then?
Please.
Sorry, thank you. There's challenges whichever way you look, John, at the root of it. Even if you went to 100% hydrogen, it's still not yet sure whether the pipework within people's households would need to get ripped out and replaced. That would be hugely disruptive as well, as you can imagine. So which path we go down, there's going to be challenges alongside it. But we are one of the few countries in Europe that has such a high reliance on gas. Most other countries have much higher electricity penetration, so that route is surmountable. But the challenge is more in the peak winter demand, as Tom said, just the scale of effort you need, which is why kind of a hybrid, why it's not black and white, I think is probably the answer to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Seminar. Thank you.
Thank you both. So I think we have another question from Stuart Strathby about the heat pumps. What is the current average cost, and if we could set up a community loan scheme? And then for those of us renting, how do we persuade, incentivize landlords to adopt it? I don't know if any of the panelists would like to respond to this. So
I'll just come in.
It's about the heat pumps, difference between those who rent and those who own.
Yeah, I can't really answer that one, and I'm afraid I don't really know much about the costs of the heat pump either, although I know that in Leeds we are looking to upgrade some of our off-gas council properties to heat pumps, because that's a more cost-effective route than very out-of-date electrical heating systems, or indeed oil. But I'm afraid I don't know the actual techniques. The things I just wanted to raise was that idea of a community loan scheme. So I think the issue of innovative finance for low carbon solutions is worth developing and exploring more actively. So Leeds City Council was one of several local authorities that took part in a research project a couple of years ago, bizarrely run by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. No idea why, but anyway. It involved looking at whether there weren't so much community loans, it was crowdfunding could be used as a way of raising capital for low carbon initiatives. It's taken a long time, but the final result is that we can, legally we can, and also that it is a cost-effective route for us to pursue, because some people will know that local authorities are in the fortunate position we can borrow money from the Public Works Loan Board very cheaply, although it has gone up recently, and it probably will go up again, I suspect, with the COVID costs. But that, so for us to be able to pursue crowdfunding, it had to be able to compete with the Public Works Loan Board. And after a lot of work between the researchers and our Treasury team, we've come up with a way of doing it that would be effective. So we're hoping, all things being equal, and we probably have to review it again all post-COVID, but we're hoping that we can roll this initiative out as a pilot. It would actually not be for heat pumps, it would be for solar panels on some council buildings later this year. But I think it was more the general point about, yeah, community loans, some sort of innovative finance things. I think these options need to be explored and tried at a greater scale than they are at the moment.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. I had the related questions from Kevin from Leeds TUC, whether we need the 2020 Lucas plan to link trade unions with uni research departments. I think this is more of a kind of strategic questions about how to gather expertise and forces here. I don't know if Kevin wanted to articulate better this question, or if anyone wanted to say anything about that.
I can say something in response, if that's okay,
Please.
Unless Kevin wants to speak. Because the other side of the stuff I do is actually I am part of the new Lucas Plan project, which is not, whilst PCS support that as a union, it's something I do more as independently. I mean, I think, yes, absolutely, we do need a new 2020 Lucas Plan across many areas, and the fact that a lot of university departments are just aligned with business on that profit-making side rather than the bottom-up planning and working within local communities is a really sad loss, and we need to get back to some of those ideas that came out of the Lucas Plan about joining up with sort of, when I say industrial plans, it always means kind of like heavy industry, but obviously across a range of sectors. So I mean, personally, it's something I very much support, and I think it's not just talking about, trade unions say this all the time, we need workers at the table because they've got the knowledge, but actually what we don't do is draw out and use that knowledge, because the amount of times I get unions telling me, but a gas fitter can't do that. Well, that's brilliant. If a gas fitter can't do that, let the gas fitter say what can be done and be part of developing that discussion. And as the question was asked, working with universities and with everybody who needs to be there to have these discussions.
Yeah, somehow I couldn't agree more. Also, someone who is involved in the university. Okay, that's great. So let's move on. We had a question from Katie Louise Tyers. Do you know who, if anyone, is Tom equivalent in Kirksley Council? Have, I think this is West Yorkshire Combined Authority, got a joint strategy for this? Anyone wants to talk about the work, West Yorkshire Combined Authority?
I can just mention a few things. There is someone with a broadly equivalent role in Kirklees. I think he's called John. I can't remember his surname. But I think it's a general truism that a lot of the local authorities outside the big cities have much less resources for this kind of thing. But at the West Yorkshire level, I'm not sure they have a strategy at the moment on heat decarbonisation. They have looked at the economic impact of things like hydrogen conversion. They are at the moment working on some decarbonisation pathway work, which I think should be published quite soon. And I think hydrogen is one of those pathways that they're looking at. So I think that will all be coming out in the public domain quite soon. But the energy unit there at the West Yorkshire Combined Authority will, I'm sure, be able to help update. And yeah, I think it's called John at Kirklees, but I can't remember his surname.
We'll try to share these details after the meetings as well. And as you were speaking still, there was another question for you, Tom, from Pauline Bailey. How many local authority jobs, especially public sector jobs, will this create, or will all the jobs stay in the private sector?
But by this, I'm assuming you're meaning a hydrogen conversion policy. Yeah. So there's only been very little economic analysis of this, done a few years ago by West Yorkshire, and the analysis at the time showed that you would be creating around 5,000 additional full-time equivalents. And over 290 millions of additional annual GVA, but that would those figures would be dwarfed. Those figures are for kind of Yorkshire region type jobs, but that would be, like I said before, hydrogen conversion doesn't make sense just doing it in Leeds or Yorkshire. It would have to be part of a national programme. So those figures would be much higher if a policy decision was taken on that. Whether those are public or private sector, I don't know. I presume they would be mainly in the private sector, but I'm afraid I don't know the precise answer to that.
Thank you, Tom. Then we had Simon Brett. I'm not sure whether this was just a comment or you would like to speak about retrofit, or Simon? Ellen, would you like to allow?
Yeah, sorry, Simon Brett. Yeah. Okay, you can speak. Unmute yourself, Simon, and then you can speak.
All right, well, it's just a general question. Speaking as I'm a PCS worker in HMRC in Yorkshire, and one of the problems we often have when we're talking about retrofitting and energy efficiency is the discussion primarily seems to be about people's homes, which is all fine, but some of the biggest sources of pollution are workplaces. There needs to be a plan of retrofitting workplaces as well. For my own workplace, it's just as important as anywhere else, because when it comes to hot summers, it can be a very uncomfortable place to work. And so retrofitting it would be also a health benefit as well. So we do need, as part of this mass campaign of retrofitting, you're right, but we need to consider workplaces as well as buildings. And do any of the panel know if any of that is being considered yet or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone from the panelists like to reply to this, or?
I can feed in. So you're right, Simon. We talk about homes, don't we? The government has made some monies available for public sector retrofits, but we're working with others to push for more in that agenda. Again, the Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group has been pushing for around the public and the kind of office commercial side of it as well. One observation, of course, is that housing retrofitting will be critical this winter coming up as well, won't it? If COVID-19 and people working at home more and self-installation happens, there'll be many more people in fuel poverty. That's not an excuse for not getting on to do commercial and offices, but housing retrofits has to be right there as well, which I think we would agree on.
Thank you. So sorry, it's not as easy to keep up with all the order, but I think it was we had some question now from David Barnes. Just a second, please. Question to Tom: what are your thoughts on how the Leeds financial position, government, emerging from the promised COVID support and council climate action in Leeds? I don't know if David, you want to say more about this, or
shall I bring David in for a second?
Yeah, I think he had some noise issues in his house. But
David, are you? Yeah, you should be able to speak now.
Hi there. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, thanks. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's just thinking about the kind of things that Tom was talking about and what's going on in Leeds, such as the district heating network and all the things that the council are doing since they declared a climate emergency. And obviously now there's massive financial risk that's happened because of COVID, and the fact that the government at the moment, as far as I understand, are not actually going to follow through with their promise to support Leeds City Council in the way they're supposed to, and just what impact that might have on the work of the council in terms of tackling the climate emergency. That would be great.
Yeah, it's very important. Tom, I'm afraid that you are on the spot here.
The man from the council. Yeah, so obviously, I mean, I'm just an officer, so I'm some of those straight into more of a political arena, and I'm sure those debates are being had by councillors in Leeds. At the moment, from the officer perspective, and the encouraging thing is that Leeds has retained its 3 strategic priorities, which are inclusive growth, health and well-being, and climate emergency. There's absolutely no indication that any of those is being dropped, even in the light of COVID. And in fact, the climate emergency element needs to be kind of taken forward as part of any recovery package that comes forward in the city. So I think the yeah, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. You know, if there's less money, there's less money. So it's always going to be a challenge. But things like district heating continues. Our work on the clean air zone in Leeds continues, albeit it's been delayed a bit. Our work on improving the energy efficiency of council buildings and council homes continues, and it's all seen as part of the COVID recovery as well. But yeah, I mean, obviously, when there's less money around, things will tighten. But at the moment, there's no indication that okay, we just drop climate emergency.
Tom, we have I think Chris Broom wanted to actually speak about hydrogen again. Chris Broom? Alan, can you enable?
Sorry, Chris.
BR.
Chris.
Hello.
Hi. Please.
Yes, just frantically unmuting. Looking at all these plans, I think most speakers agree that hydrogen's extremely difficult, and electricity generation, renewables generation in very large quantities is also very difficult. And I'd just add that all infrastructure, or most of it, is mainly high carbon. So again, it's coming back to the economic model. If you actually have a really determined drive to invest in public services, in nature, in care, in health, all these things that are actually fundamental to people, surely that is the only alternative. But, oh, sorry, it's not an alternative, it's the only way forward. The difficulty being that, of course, you've got these vested union interests, and you've got a government that only sees the way forward as being through economic growth through technology, won't accept anything else. So I just feel that we, myself as a campaigner, we need to be very, very direct and firm about that, because it's going to be very difficult to shift.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. We have Simon Perani who would like to say something as well. Please, Simon.
You're on, Simon, if you unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for a really informative seminar. I want to come back to the hydrogen strategy. In my view, this is, I think it's fair to say that it's basically been launched as a survival strategy for oil companies who, if they really believed in the climate emergency they all talk about, would be seeking to wind down their operations on the North Sea, but of course are not. Their strategy is maximizing economic recovery with government support. So they're seeing hydrogen as a way out of this. It relies on CCS technology, which, as Les has pointed out, it's yet been proven to work at scale. So I think we, as people in the labour movement, we have to think about this union support for this initiative in that context. You can't support initiatives like this if you're serious about a climate emergency. And so my question, which is I suppose to Sam and to any of the other panelists, is first of all, I think it would be good to put together an alternative strategy based on the things that Mike has talked about, energy efficiency, retrofitting, heat pumps. These are clearly the priorities. It's always about priorities. There's always going to be technologies battling with each other. And in the labour movement, I believe these should be our priorities. And the second question, I think there's an opportunity to link the work you're doing in Yorkshire, which is great to have this kind of event, so important to bring this discussion out. And I think there's an opportunity to link that with those in Scotland. It is not the case that, as union leaders would have you believe, that unions and the entire workforce on the North Sea only see a future, that only see jobs as oil and gas jobs, and only see a future with the oil and gas industry. In fact, there's a platform, the NGO has just done a survey, or they're doing a survey. They're getting massive results returned from workers on the North Sea that they're ready to retrain. Overwhelming majority of their, it's a very interesting survey that they'll be publishing soon. So I think there's a great opportunity to link up the work you're doing with energy efficiency and so on with those in Scotland campaigning for a just transition more rapidly away from oil and gas production. Thanks.
Anyone would like to comment on this from the panel, please?
Yeah, I don't mind coming back to Simon. Yeah, in terms of alternative strategies, I completely agree, and I think that there's two things we have to do. I mean, one in PCS, and as Simon Brett will know very well, and really pleased to know Simon as one of our PCS reps, that we always put forward alternatives. It's not just talking about what we're against. You know, we have to talk as well with knowledge and understanding about the technologies and the issues. So I think there has to be bottom-up approaches. And you know, many of you are probably aware, Unite only changed its fracking policy when there was a push from the rank and file on the floor of their conference a few years ago. And I think unless that push comes from beneath, then we won't get some of these changes. But I think on the other side, there has to be an education process going on, because a lot of people don't really understand about hydrogen, and it's often not talked about in terms of blue or green hydrogen, and then what electrolysis is and steam methane reforming. And I know just anecdotally in Unison, for example, there's not necessarily a collective view in Unison about why they're supporting hydrogen. And I think someone just put in the chat there about democratic deficits. Yes, it's about how these conversations take place in Union. I'm actually a GMB member, and there are particular issues around democracy within the GMB. And I think, you know, again, Simon's made a really important point. Don't blame the workers. Workers live in the real world. They see what's going on. They participate. You know, they have their children participating in climate strikes. But at the end of the day, they've got a job and livelihood to earn. So until there's alternatives, they will continue to do that. But they're not sitting there thinking we desperately must be drilling for oil, etc. I mean, there might be a few, but it's how you engage and how you start that democratic process, which is the important point.
Yes, I'll just briefly add, I agree. And, you know, as I mentioned before, the whole narrative of Britain competing in a global race with the cooperation between the trade unions and the employers, you know, reinforces perhaps a sense of desperation underlying that drive, that the only way to maintain decent livelihoods would be to subordinate ourselves to that agenda. And this excludes a wide range of alternatives, which of course are always linking some technological apparatus with the organizational form, which we should always emphasize. So the attraction of alternatives lies partly in those alternative forms, which might be called worker community cooperatives, goes by many names. And this is what can attract people. And of course, some technologies lend themselves better to such forms than others. I mean, the agenda for decarbonizing natural gas could only happen with a centralized system run by national companies.
Yeah.
Anyone else from the panel wanted to say something on this? Or we have another question or comment by Andy Walker. I wonder if Andy wants to speak, or shall I read the question? Andy. Shall I just read it? And I'd like to speak, please. Alan, if you can.
You're on, Andy, if you want to. There you go.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Hello, Tom. Hello, Dave. Hello, Ellen. All the other people I know. The key thing here is that the conservation of energy is cheaper, quicker, and easier than creating energy by any other means. That has to be the focus. One of the things that is been said by the Leeds citizens jury was that the second most important priority after transport is to fix our homes. And this is so going to challenge fuel poverty. It's so going to deal with health and well-being. The respiratory illnesses that the NHS has to deal with would be massively reduced. The key thing that a climate emergency ought to give us is the ability to cancel all previous contracts and start again. So the cozy relationship that many councils have with the big construction companies and their bonuses and the shareholder dividends should be moved away from, And the opportunity to move to a social enterprise-based, a locally community-based way of tackling homes means that for half the price that a company could do it, a corporate company, you could actually approach EPC A or B rather than just EPC C, which I understand is the current target. I'd really like to hear that Leeds City Council has got some plans to move in this direction.
Thank you, Andy. On my list, there is David Barnagan. He had a question for all TUC colleagues. GMB are leading a campaign to back hydrogen. Is there dialogue with GMB and the others to resolve this conflict? I don't know if anyone on the panel or Alan want to comment on this GMB position.
Well, I think Sam's already said a bit about it. I don't know if Sam wants to come in at this point.
I can say a little bit more. I mean, I think it's probably interesting as well to hear what perhaps at local Yorkshire level is happening in terms of engagement with the GMB. But I mean, from my level, obviously I'm a national officer. I sit in meetings with the GMB and we have these discussions. They know our position. It's very hard to have any engagement. I mean, frankly, it's similar in terms of where they were with fracking. It's similar in terms of nuclear, and for them, it's just jobs, and it doesn't matter. And we've had the same discussions, alarmingly, around defence diversification as well. So really, for them, and I'd say their leadership again, I think it's important to distinguish beyond sort of ordinary members and workers in sectors that they are just so entrenched in their views. I can guess at why, and this probably isn't the forum to be making guesses, but it's very hard to have a dialogue, and that's why I think those bottom-up rank and file approaches really are important to this, because unless the conversations start in the branches and with the membership in there, then I mean certainly at national levels it's not going to happen. We just sit in meetings and disagree with us. What I am worried about at the moment, particularly from the changing leadership of the Labour Party, a lot of positions that are now being pushed forward, such as this hydrogen strategy, you can see a real opportunism now that there's probably going to be a move away from the Socialist Green New Deal that was agreed at Labour Party conference, the 2030 targets, and actually just pushing a lot of these technologies through. And I think that's why you probably see quite a bit of confidence coming out. And unfortunately, in a lot of the sort of green recovery narrative, hydrogen is in there. And again, it's really said without much detail about what that means and other alternatives and alternative strategies that could be pursued.
Can I just interject, just to give everyone a heads up that we're really technically we're out of time for this section of the session, but I think we should probably just allow a couple more minutes for things that I know people are waiting to speak, but we do need to be very quick, otherwise the panelists won't be able to have time to sum up.
Yeah, I mean. David asked to, because I forgot to say that the panel was also welcome to comment on what Andy Walker said. So David reminded me, can someone please ask to respond to Andy Walker?
Was that the question about the GMB?
No, the previous point that Andy made about the citizens' jury.
Oh.
Yep, I'm happy to come back on that one. Yep, I think that raises a really important point. I think we all the speakers said that we recognise that energy retrofit has got to be the first priority. And since the citizens' jury, there's at least 3 new initiatives that have kicked off in the council. First, regarding the council's own stock of homes, because we have about 20,000 homes of our own. So we're working with the University of Leeds and Leeds Beckett to prioritise the it's up to £80 million that's spent every year on our own council homes stock, so that we can see how we can get the best carbon return on that investment in our own council stock, which is already some of the best performing in the city, but obviously also houses some of the most vulnerable residents in the city. So we want to make sure that that's been targeted best. Secondly, the Climate Commission has been carrying out an assessment of how ready the city is in different sectors of the economy to deliver on the low carbon emission, and we just completed an assessment of how ready we are to deliver the low carbon assessment around for housing. Even if the money was available, which we've addressed earlier in this conversation this morning, one of the key barriers is that delivery capacity. So I think the proposal that Andy mentions there about enhancing the ability of social enterprises to play their part in this would be an important element of increasing the delivery capacity of the city to be able to retrofit at scale. The assessment shows that even if the money was there, all the policies were there, we actually haven't got the supply chains all set up and so on to do it. I've already mentioned the lobbying work that the council does with government to ask for additional funding to support greater domestic retrofit as part of a national strategy. We'll just have to see whether that's successful or not. But finally, Leeds was one of I think it's about 6 cities that have been working with BEIS on how heat reduction in the domestic sector can be addressed at a neighbourhood level. That's a piece of work that's going on nationally, so it's not available yet. But that's already revealing some interesting findings about how community-based interventions can be supported. So there is work going on, and I sincerely hope it gets to the stage where we can deliver this retrofit kind of renaissance that we've all spoken about.
Thank you, Tom. I think we are coming to the end of this part of the meeting. So just before handing it over to Alan again, I just wanted to say that we are saving the chat with all the links, with all the useful, very helpful links and the comments that you have made. So thanks everyone really for making this meeting so rich. And yeah, if it's okay, I'll pass it over to Alan. We'll try to engage with the points raised in the chat as well at the next meeting, at the follow-up meeting. So please stay in touch and join us also for the next one. Alan, is that okay if I pass it this?
Yes, thanks ever so much for managing that section. It sounds like it must have been a really high pressure job. So thanks. And we'll all have time to unwind a bit afterwards and listen to the recording and read through the chat again. Can I just before we pass on, just remind people that I have put the invitation link to the follow-up meeting in the chat, and of course we'll be sending out reminders as well. So without any further ado, I think I'm just going to ask our panelists to give a final summary in the same order that they came. I make it 12 minutes to 1, so I guess you're trying to aim for three or 4 minutes, but I recognise that might be impossible. So just say what you need to say, yeah. So let's start with Mike again, please.
Thanks, Alan, for the invite and for the comments, and Gabriella for sharing that. I think from our perspective, look, it's not energy efficiency isn't rocket science, and everybody agrees that's the way forward. And that's where the campaigning and the public pressure really needs to be on, for fuel poverty reasons as well as environmental reasons. And the social dimension to the climate emergency that the unions and others bring is really important. We try and capture that in our work as much as we can as well, because that's a core part of our values. So energy efficiency has to be the priority, and I take the point that needs to be beyond just homes. That needs to be more broadly. but the government isn't loosening the purse strings to enable that happen, and that cost should be socialised and should be driven forward. In some areas, regulation can drive it forward, like the private rented sector, for example, and we can look to Scotland that is ahead of the game for some of the ideas in that space. Second thing is that heat pumps clearly has to be a major part of that solution as well. Again, that's got to be something that's equitable and available to all, and currently the system is only really available for people who've got money in the bank, and the government's new proposed capital grants that don't go far enough are also exclude large sections of the population, which isn't right and proper. We need something like 10 million heat pumps fitted over the next 10 years as well. And the last thing I would say is, there are more and more, the fossil fuel industry is not going to go away without a fight. And many of the workers in the fossil fuel industry, as Sam pointed out, want to see a transition as well, away from that industry, but with high quality jobs in other industries. And the just transition is central to that. But yes, the vested interests in the oil and gas industry are fighting hard across the whole of Europe to push hydrogen and CCS as a magic bullet solution for the future, with a technology that isn't proven at scale and stores up risks for the future and still brings large CO2 penalties. So the pathway, I think, forward is quite straightforward, but there's lots of power, as always, working the other direction. So campaigning from the unions, from the grassroots, the unions particularly, and from environmental organisations and the fuel poverty sector, I think is going to be really important over the next months as we move forward on this.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think that was a great summing up. Can we move on swiftly to Les, please?
Yes, further to the hydrogen agenda, the situation is even worse than Sam mentioned. And before the last general election, the Labour Party published an extra document along with its manifesto. It was called Green Industrial Revolution, and this fully adopted the agenda of the natural gas industry for exactly what was relaunched, perhaps for the second or third time last week. And why did they do so? Well, one reason was they were pushed to do so by the energy unions. So this will be an ongoing problem within the Labour Party and within the broader Labour movement. There needs to be a way at least to start fracturing this cross-crass alliance being led by the officials of those trade unions. I wish I could suggest how to do that, but certainly alternatives would help. There's credible alternatives backed by a multi-stakeholder alliance. In that regard, the Lucas Plan idea is worth reviving, but especially around the central concept, namely socially useful production, which goes beyond any specific technology. It's a central principle for judging what kind of production is worthwhile in the first place, for what uses, as the basis for considering technological alternatives. Another lesson to learn is that the Lucas Plan was blocked as much by the trade union leadership as it was by the Lucas management, because they both saw it as a threat to their authority. So to bypass those obstacles for socially useful production, we need a much broader multi-stakeholder alliance that can break away potential supporters within trade unions to a different formation. Energy efficiency would be a good example, because in itself, it's not a specific technology. It's a broad range of measures involving a broad range of skills which people already have or could gain. And this leads to the issue of jobs, a term which has a stereotype as something given by employers. And this severely restricts the imagination about what could be the basis for decent, enjoyable livelihoods. These could have many forms. It could be created by, as we said before, community, trade union, public sector backed cooperatives. So we need ways to spark people's imagination through pilot projects, trying out these possibilities, and some ways to gain at least some modest support from local authorities to have demonstration projects for the alternative social forms alongside the alternative technological solutions. I finished there.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, let's just go on to Tom, please.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to all of the other panelists and for all the contributors for a really interesting discussion. I've enjoyed it, and I think I've enjoyed being able to sort of talk, sometimes personally, sometimes reflecting the council's point of view. But there you go. I think in terms of where significant action needs to take place, I think there needs to be a clear national policy on decarbonising heat, and we shouldn't drift into either electrification or hydrogen just by default. It needs to be a clear policy. There should, but above all, I think, as we've all said, that we need a national infrastructure approach to home and building retrofitting, with funding for households in fuel poverty and incentives for the able to pay. We need to revise the current standards for private landlords so that they can no longer get away with having poor quality homes for rent. And we need new types of funding for local authorities to bring in investment into the city, creating jobs in support of Leeds meeting its low carbon targets. And for new build, which we haven't really talked about so much today, but we need a single standard for new developments in planning to be set at the highest standard for sustainability. The final thing I'd say is that Leeds is an ambitious city which has set itself some ambitious targets in this area. But above all, I think that the council is really open to the fact that the council cannot possibly do this alone. Collaboration with partners from across the city and broader, including trade unions, pressure groups, academics, and so forth. That needs to be part of it. There isn't. No one's got all of the answers out of the way. But Leeds is a city that is keen to be a place where some of these new ideas are tried out at scale, so that we can bring the benefits of a low carbon economy to the city and its residents.
Thank you very much, Tom, and given you a high pressure ride there, but I think you handled it quite well, very well indeed. So. We'll pass you over to Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. I'd just like to echo everybody else and the thanks for the richness of the discussion in this meeting, and obviously organising it. I think it's been really helpful because, you know, we should never be developing our thoughts in silos to each other and try and find out where we've got points of consensus, where clearly there are many around what we've been talking about today. But I suppose I'll just focus on a couple of things. One, I think it's really important about the local discussions and the ideas that have come up around the Lucas plan. I think we do need to revive, not just because I've got a very personal interest in it, but if I just think of my own experience, 2 weeks ago I was involved in a call with Fuel Poverty Action, who organises not just on fuel poverty action, they've been doing lots of stuff around cladding and district heat networks and those wider energy issues. And it was really fascinating because, you know, that was with real people with energy issues in their homes, in social housing. And, you know, and I think you always have to sort of relate policy back down to real people, and whether that's workers, whether it's residents, whether it's people in public buildings. And I think, you know, everybody there knew the answers to the solution, knew the solutions to the problems, and including calling for solar panels on all buildings, which I entirely agree with. I actually think that all the roof space should be requisitioned for solar panels where possible, and that fed into the energy system, although there is a block there because of the privatised model, which is another question. So I think we do need to come back to those Lucas plan ideas and ways of organising. And one of the critical things, and which Les touched upon, is how unions organise. And I don't think we really discuss this, I wouldn't even say enough, barely at all, because I think one of the problems we have right now is our own trade union model. Obviously, we developed around a particular fossil fuel industrial agenda, and the world is shifting, not necessarily so rapidly as we like, but it's changing. And even for trade unions, there's clearly a fear about how that's impacting their own structures and organisational ability. So at some point, we have to confront that. There are sort of more straightforward things around collective bargaining and sectorial negotiation, for example. But I think that then may get us into some of the different areas of debate that we need to be having about what does the future look like for all workers and communities within that, and what should it look like within our climate justice framing as well. And then I think we start to delve into different and very difficult conversations, but until we start doing that, I don't think we will shift a lot of these debates fundamentally. And I'd just like to say, I mean, obviously Leeds TUC has organised this meeting, and we don't say enough about our local structures in the trade union movement around trades councils. I'm also part of my local trades council, and I think it's a really good space where we can develop these discussions, particularly with rank and file members and reps who may not have the access to them. You know, they may not necessarily be climate activists or whatever, you know, many are, but many aren't. But we started to see the emergence of some of these discussions within our trades councils on the back of Extinction Rebellion, the school student strike. So I think we really have to use our trades council a lot more, and obviously they were very instrumental in terms of the Lucas plan work as well, and use those kind of more grassroots structures. So thanks again to everybody, and I really look forward to going through the chat and the, you know, listening to the recording again. I think lots of really brilliant points been made.
Thank you very much, and amazingly we're exactly on time. But I do just want to, yeah, I mean, let's move forward with this idea of a Lucas plan type thinking, but on a much wider, with a much wider scope, on focus on socially useful production in general. And I think what Sam's just said about the need to really grasp the nettle of how our trade unions are organised, and really that in a way organised in a way that is inclined to replicate, you know, the existing organisation of industry in the various sectors. Yeah, thanks for the plug for the role of the trades councils, because I think that we are, you know, we are a forum that represents grassroots members directly through branch delegates, and we have very little power within the, if you like, within the overall. It's not so easy to get these discussions filtering through to the top levels of the bureaucracies. So I don't think those are issues that really can be swept